Hello and welcome to this PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Stacey Joyce and I will be your host. If you have questions throughout the webinar, no need to wait. You can chat them in if you're with us live. Click on chat near the top left of your screen at any time and type in your question, making sure that you send that question to everyone rather than all panelists. And let's get started. Today's guest is Toby Thorne. He is a bat researcher at the Toronto Zoo in the Department of Conservation, Education and Wildlife. Thank you so much for joining us. I will let you take it away.
Oh, cool. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for, joining me to learn about bats. And bats are some of my favorite animals. So I'm very excited to talk about them with you. So I just share my screen here. And so there are a lot of myths and misconceptions about bats, and a lot of people are scared of bats. But I find that once you learn about them, you realize that they're very interesting animals indeed. And you might not realize this, but there are more than 1,300 different types of bat living around the world. And so that means that nearly 1 in 4 mammal species is a bat. And of those, 8 different types of bat live in Ontario. And you probably had them flying around your back garden or your local park, even though you might not have realized it. And within those 1,300 different types of bat, there's a lot of variation and different types of bat. And so some of them are very large, like this bat, and this bat lives in Asia, so you wouldn't see this in your garden. But the largest bat has a wingspan of almost 6 feet from tip to tip. And there are other bats which are very small. So this is the smallest bat in the world. It's called Kitti's hognose bat, and it lives in Thailand. And you can see how small it is compared to the person's thumb that is holding it. And to be clear, that is the size of the adult bat. And so its babies are even smaller. And so this is a baby Kitti's hognose bat, the smallest bat. And so there is a lot of diversity and a lot of different types of bat around the world. But as a bat researcher, the thing that makes bats most interesting to me are some of the things that they all have in common, that they all do. And so what I have playing here is a slow motion video of a bat that I caught a few years ago in England. And this is us releasing it. So you can see the bat is looking around and there it takes flight. And so flight is, of course, one of the amazing things that bats do. They are the only flying mammal. So you might have heard of flying squirrels or flying lemurs. And those animals don't fly, they glide. So they can fall, so they can travel along as they fall, and they can glide a long distance. But they can't go up, and they're not capable of actually flapping and powering themselves in flight. So bats are the only animals that can do that. And what's even more impressive about bats' flight is that they do it in the dark. So this was a video we filmed with an infrared light. So if you were there, you wouldn't be able to see anything. And it's difficult to do things at night when there's no light around to see. So here is a picture that I took in the forest at night. And you probably struggle to see anything. If I asked you to run into the forest, you might bump into that tree in front of you. And I think you'd certainly struggle to go catch me a moth, which of course a bat would be wanting to do so that it could have its dinner. And so bats have to have a way of finding their way around at night and not bumping into things and finding things that they want to eat. And a lot of animals that are active at night deal with this by having very large eyes. And so there's not much light around, so they have big eyes so that they can gather more of the light that is there. And then see when it's dark, and so this is and that's what some bats do. So this is a flying fox, and these types of bats are found in Africa and Asia and Australia, and they have these very big eyes, which makes them look like dogs, and that's why they're called flying foxes. And by having large eyes, they can see well enough in the darkness that they can find their way around. And these bats all eat fruit. And fruit tend to be quite large, and they're not very good at running away. So the bats are able to find them just by having these big eyes. But for other bats, like the bats in Canada, which are hunting insects, so like this tasty looking moth or small flies and other flying insects, however good their vision was, they would really struggle to catch those insects just using their eyes alone. And so what bats have is an entirely different mechanism, entirely different way to find their way around and to find their food. And what they do is, as they're flying along, they shout very loudly. So the bat is flying along and it makes very loud shouts, about as loud as if you were close to a jet plane, so very loud. And that sound travels away from the bat, and then it bounces off things in the environment. So in this case, this moth. And the echo of the sound bounces back, and the bat is able to hear it with very sensitive hearing. And then by using this sound, it's able to build up a picture in its head of its environment and find its way around, and so not bump into things and find food that it wants to eat. And this is similar to sonar or radar that we use for tracking planes and ships. But bats have been doing it for much longer than we have, and I think they're definitely better at it than we are. And so I have another video I want to show you. And so, so this is a video of a bat flying in to catch a moth. And so we tied this moth on a string so that we could make the video. So we made it a bit easier for the bat, and you can see the string at the top of the video. And we filmed this again in slow motion with an infrared light. So there's no light in the room. The bat couldn't see anything with its eyes, but just watch what happens. So you see the bat fly in from the left, and then it's clearly interested in the moth and having a look, and then it decides it looks tasty, so it swoops down to pluck it off the string and have some dinner. And so this is a fairly easy for the bat because the moth is not moving, but it's a good example of what bats can do just using sound instead of using their vision. And so bats make this sound in the same way that we speak. So in the same way that I'm talking now, they just produce it by exhaling over their vocal cords. And most bats emit these sounds by shouting through their mouths. So you can see in this picture, the bat has its mouth open, you can see all its teeth, and that might make it look a bit scary, like it's going to bite you. But actually the reason it has its mouth open is so that it can it can do these shouts. And so it's just looking where it's going. It's not trying to be scary. But there are other bats which, instead of emitting the sound through their mouths, they shout through their noses. And so this is a picture of a horseshoe bat. And if I put a bigger picture of its face, you can see that around the nose of this bat, there is this sort of big structure of its funny shaped nose. And what that does is it shapes the sound that the bat is making into a beam traveling forwards, which they can then use to better figure out what's around them. And it also has the advantage that they can fly along with their mouths full and still be echolocating and looking where they're going. And so so this system that bats use of using sound to find their way around is called echolocation, and it works very well for them, and it's also very useful for people like me who want to study the bats, because bats are small and they fly in the dark, and so they're hard to follow, and it's hard to find out where they are. But they help us out by emitting these sounds, because we can listen into their sounds too and figure out where they are and what type of bat it is. So it's like they're flying around telling us where they are. They're shouting, "I'm here, I'm here." And there's a slight problem, which is that the sounds bats make are very high frequency. They're very high pitched sounds, which are too high for us to hear. However, we can use special electronics and microphones to record the sounds that they make. And so with a lot of the work that I do researching bats, we monitor them by putting out devices like the one in the picture. And I leave that out in the field or wherever I'm looking for bats for a few weeks. And then I go back and I can see all of the bats that flew by, and their sound is recorded by the microphone. And I'll show you a couple of those sounds. So this is a picture of the sound made by a big brown bat. And big brown bats are the most common bat in southern Ontario and in a lot of southern Canada. So if you see bats in your garden, there's quite a strong chance that it would be one of these. And so along the on this graph, along the bottom of the graph is time, and along the side of the graph is the frequency of the sound, and it's all too high frequency for us to hear. And then the color represents how loud the sound is. And so what I'll do is I'm going to play this sound for you, and this is a kind of listening to the sound live, or if we were listening to it live. And so that's the sound of a bat flying, just flying around looking for something to eat, or looking for somewhere to go. And this is a picture, so you can see that this bat isn't scary at all. It's quite cute looking. And so this is the bat that you might well see in your garden. And I'll show you a call of a different bat. And so this is a picture. This is a picture of the sound of a red bat. So this is another bat that's found in Ontario and in eastern Canada. And what is happening here is this is the picture of the sound as the bat is catching an insect. So you can see that on the left side of the screen there is a regular call, and then on the right side the calls change shape. And the reason that they change shape like that is because the bat is closing in on its insect that it wants to eat, and so it has to adjust the sounds that it's making. So if I play this one back, you can hear a different sound and a buzz as the bat reaches the insect. So that little sort of raspberry buzz sound is the bat catching its insect. And what I can also do is play that sound back slower. So I'll play it back at 1/10 of the speed, so I've slowed it down 10 times, and then you can better hear what the sounds the bat is making. So hopefully you could hear how through that recording, the sounds got faster and faster and closer together. And if you remember that this is the sound slowed down, so the bat was actually doing that 10 times faster, then you start to get an idea of how impressive their ability to use sound in this way is. And then there's a picture of the eastern red bat, and you can see how it got its name with that bright red orange color. And so finally, so listening to bats in this way gives me as a bat researcher a lot of opportunity to learn about bats. I can find out where they are, or how many they are. But I also, I just like bats. I've been chasing bats since I was 11, and I just like to listen to them. So I'm going to finish with a little video just showing some bats flying around. And as they fly, I've got a recording of the echolocation that they're making, so you can hear the sounds they make as they fly. So, so that's my presentation on bats, and I hope you think they sound as cool as I do.
Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I certainly learned a lot, and I really enjoyed how many images and videos and the sounds you shared. That 1/10 speed recording was phenomenal. I can only imagine what that poor insect was thinking as those sounds got closer and closer together. But we already have plenty of questions, so I'm happy to start feeding those to you one at a time. The first question I have is from Ms. Waters, grade 4s at Maurice Cody Junior Public School in Toronto. They would like to know, what is the impact of lights on bats?
Bats are, as I mentioned, they're mostly active at night. And there's a lot of different reasons that they're active at night. And one of those is that there are fewer things around at night that would want to eat them. So apart from maybe an occasional owl, there aren't any animals that eat bats. And however, if there's light, it can make them more visible so that other animals can see them. And so it can make them more at risk of being eaten. And so they do tend to avoid light, but I guess it's a complicated answer. So on the whole, bats don't like light. It disturbs them, and it puts them at risk of being eaten and things like that. However, sometimes bats do like light. So there are some bats like the red bat that I showed you a picture of, which actually will look for insects flying around the light. So the moth is attracted to the light and the bat is attracted and catches the moth by the light. So it can be good or bad.
I see. Well, that brings me to a related question then from Ms. Smith-Bischoff's grade 3s in Bowmanville. They were asking, what are the predators of bats?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there aren't very many animals that eat bats because they fly at night and they're hard to catch. So owls might sometimes take a bat if they get the chance. In tropical countries, there are a few birds. There's a bird called the bat hawk, which specializes on catching bats just as they come out before it gets completely dark. But apart from that, the main animal which attacks bats is the domestic cat. So sometimes people's pet cats get out and they might try and catch bats. And so that can actually be the biggest problem.
Interesting. Ms. Zorzetto's grade 2-3 class in Hamilton wanted to know, Aiden actually, wanted to know, why do bats hang upside down a lot?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And we always have pictures of bats hanging upside down. And one of the main reasons for hanging upside down is that they can take off quickly. So they're just hanging from their feet. So if they want to take off and start flying, they just need to let go and they can drop down and then immediately they're flying. But bats don't always they do tend to be upside down, but they're not always hanging sort of in the middle of the ceiling. A lot of bats like to squeeze into holes. So a lot of bats live in holes in trees or in cavities like that. So they actually like to sort of squeeze in and be nice and tucked up in a sort of secure space.
And Ms. Zorzetto's class also wanted to know, how many bats live at the Toronto Zoo and where did they come from?
Oh, that's a good question. So we have one species of bat that we have captive at the Toronto Zoo. So if you come visit the zoo, there are some fruit bats in one of our buildings that you can visit, and those are our only captive bats. And I don't know where they come from, although they probably come from other zoos and other collections. And then we also have some wild bats flying around. So recently we've been using the recorders to record bats flying around the zoo. So we know that actually in the area around the zoo, we have all 8 species of bat that live in Ontario flying around us here.
Excellent. We now have a question from Rowan in Fergus, Ontario, who wants to know if bats were around in the dinosaur era.
So I don't know the answer to that one for sure. Bats evolved about 4 million years ago, so I don't know if they overlapped with the dinosaurs, but they've been around for quite a long time.
Okay. And so there you have a little research project, Rowan. You can see how long ago the dinosaurs were extinct and whether that overlaps or not, 4 million years. Next question we have from a grade 6 student asking, could bats only use echolocation and not their eyes?
Yeah, they definitely can do that. So people have done experiments on bats where they put little blindfolds on them so that they can't see, and then you can let them fly around and they fly around fine like that.
And I'm just going to start giving you these fast and furious. I think we've got lots of questions coming in. We have a grade 3 student in Ms. Chapman's class who wanted to know if all bats have fangs.
Well, all bats have teeth. I don't like to call them fangs because that makes them scary. But they do all have teeth, and some bats have quite big teeth because they eat fruit and they need big teeth to crunch through the tough skin of the fruit. So most of the scary-looking teeth are actually the fruit-eating bats.
And we also have another question from Ms. Chapman's class asking, why do bats often bite? Are they dangerous?
It's a good question. So, like any animal, bats, if you pick a bat up, it will probably try and bite you, and that's because it's scared of you, and it wants to get away. So bats, on the whole, are not dangerous, but there is a disease called rabies, which bats in Canada do carry, and so the number of the bats that have this disease or that carry this disease is very low. But it is quite bad. So if any of you find a bat on the ground, or you encounter a bat, you shouldn't try and pick it up, because there is a danger of that. So you should try and find a local wildlife rescue place or something similar. And so someone who knows what they're doing can come out and rescue the bat. So it would only bite because it's scared, but there is a small number of them that have this disease that is important to avoid.
So that's great advice for if our students come across a bat, perhaps on the ground. What if they find themselves in an area where perhaps all of a sudden there are bats that take flight around them? What should a person do in that scenario?
Well, if you're outside and you see bats coming out of a house, or if you're at your cottage and you have bats in your cottage, or you're just lucky enough to see them coming out of a tree, then my advice would be just to sit down and watch them and enjoy it, because I think it's fascinating to watch them flying. You're not going to disturb them. They're not going to fly up to you, or they might fly close to you just to have a look at you, but they're not going to land on you and bite you. That would never happen. And there is a bit of a myth that bats get caught in your hair, but that's not true. There are bats which can pluck a spider from its web without disturbing the web, and if they can do that, they're not going to have much trouble avoiding your hair. However, when we are sort of out in the evening, our body heat, the heat that we give off, attracts insects, and so there might be insects flying around you because of your body heat. And so the bat might fly in to eat those. So it might fly close to you to eat your insects, but it's not going to get caught in your hair or do anything like that.
Well, it's very interesting because I hadn't heard that myth, but we actually did have a few questions you answered before I could ask them about bats getting caught in hair. So other people had definitely heard that. Next question from a grade 7 student in Calgary, Alberta, asking, how long have you professionally studied bats?
Well, so I first saw bats. I went to a presentation when I was 11 years old, and then after that we went out for a walk and we listened to bats with bat detectors. But I suppose I wasn't professional at that stage. So that was when I was 11, and when I was a teenager, I spent a lot of my time out catching bats. And then I went to university, so I did an undergraduate degree in biology, which was not specifically about bats. And then about 4 years ago, I did a master's degree researching bats, and then I've been getting paid to do stuff with bats ever since then. So I suppose I turned professional about 4 years ago, but I've been doing stuff with bats for a lot longer.
Nice. Okay, let me see what else we have here. We had a couple questions surrounding the different types of bats and how they may differ. So let's go to a grade 3 class in Bowmanville asking, do all bats make the same noise? And related, we had another question about if all bats use echolocation.
So there's two good questions. I'll answer the second one first. And the answer to that is no. So most bats use echolocation, but some of them, so some of the big fruit bats like the flying fox that I had a picture of, they just use their eyes, so they don't make echolocation sounds. And then beyond that, yes, bats do make different sounds. Different types of bat do make different sounds. However, it's a little bit complicated. Because the type of sound that each bat makes is dependent on what it's trying to do. So the type of environment it flies in and the type of food that it eats. And so different types of bat which fly in similar places end up sounding very similar. So sometimes it's hard to tell the different types of bat apart. So some of them are easy and some of them sound very similar and we can't tell them apart. So of the 8 different types of bat in Ontario, three of them are very closely related and they sound very similar. So it's hard to be sure which one we've listened to. And so with those, it's best to catch them to confirm. But so we can do a lot, but it's not perfect, and it's complicated.
Interesting. And we have a question from a grade 5 in Calgary who wanted to know how bats are important to our ecosystem.
Oh, so that's a very good question. So around the world, bats do a lot of different things that are important to the ecosystem. So some of the fruit bats that live in the jungle in the tropics, they are important because they spread the seeds of the fruit that they eat. So the bat eats fruit like figs, and then as it's flying around, it poops out the seeds. And so it spreads them around the forest, and that's important for the plant to then get spread around and to keep growing. There are some bats which feed on nectar, so they like bees. So like bees or hummingbirds, they drink nectar from the flowers, and as they do that, they get the flowers pollen on them, and then they carry that to the next flower, and that's how those plants are able to reproduce. And so that relationship with bats is important to a lot of plants. I think there's several thousand different types of plant which are pollinated by bats, and there are even some plants from which that we get products that we use. So some cocoa beans, which are made to used to make chocolate, come from plants pollinated by bats. Things like balsa wood and tequila also come from plants pollinated by bats. And then finally, the insect-eating bats, and so all of the bats in Canada eat insects, and a lot of the bats around the world eat insects. And so those are helpful because they help control the number of insects. So we can have a lot of bats, and those bats eat an awful lot of insects, and so they keep down the annoying bugs that you might have in your garden or that farmers might have to worry about eating their crops. So yeah, around the world, bats do a lot of important things.
Very interesting. So we have a couple of questions here from the grade 3s in Bowmanville. First, we were just talking about a lot of different kinds of bats and different ways that they help our ecosystem. Can you remind us again, how many different species of bats do we know about?
Well, there's about 1,300. We keep finding more, so it goes up.
That is a lot of different species of bats. What do they eat in the winter?
Well, so wintertime is a problem, certainly for the bats in Canada. And the short answer is that they don't eat anything because there's nothing for them to eat. And so of the eight different types of bat in Ontario, and so similar for many across the rest of the country, so some of them hibernate in the winter. So they go find somewhere safe, like a cave, where it's not too cold, and they sleep through in the cave for several months. So in the summertime, they have to eat a lot of insects and get fat, and then that fat stores energy, and they use that to stay alive through the winter. And during hibernation, their bodies get colder and they slow down. And so they're not using as much energy, and that's how they're able to survive. But then there are other species of bat, including the red bat that I showed the picture of, which apparently didn't fancy spending winter in a cave. And so those bats, instead of hibernating, they fly south. And so they might fly hundreds or even thousands of kilometers south into the US. And they go until they find a place where it's warm enough that they can stay active through the winter and there's still insects to eat. So they go all the way down there and they wait out the cold. And then at the end of the winter, so around April time, so around next month, they come back to Canada. So those bats will be coming back in about 1 month's time.
Very interesting. We've got one class who's been waiting so patiently that I haven't asked their questions yet. I didn't forget about you. Ms. Dixon's class in Calgary. First, we have a question from Anthony, who wanted to know, how intelligent are bats compared to other mammals?
Oh, well, that's a difficult question, because I think that intelligence is kind of a human term that we put on animals. I don't really know how to answer that. Bats are pretty smart. They're very good at what they do. And the fact that they've been around for so long shows that they're very good at what they do. And they find their way around with echolocation, and that's quite complicated. But other animals don't need to do that, and they do just as well. So I think they're about as smart as they need to be.
Another lesson in how comparisons don't always really mean anything, I suppose. Let's move on to one other question from Ms. Dixon's class. Kevin asked, why do bats need eyes if they use echolocation?
Well, that's a fair point. So bats, although they use echolocation to get around, they do use their eyes as well. So there are some bats which come out before it gets too dark, and so they do actually use their eyes a little bit as well. And it's also useful for them to interact with each other, and if they're looking for a place to live, so if they're looking for a hole in a tree or something like that, then having eyes is helpful for that as well. So they do use their eyes, and it is useful, but they could also manage without them with their echolocation, I suppose.
Well, it looks like we've already gone over time by just a bit. I want to squeeze in two more questions here if we can.
Yeah.
The first question is a compilation question from Owen and Sienna, grade 2-3 students in Ms. Zorzetto's class in Hamilton, Ontario. They asked, how might a bat survive in a tsunami or in a tornado?
Well, I'm afraid that I don't think it would do very well. So bats don't like to fly if it's too windy. So if it's a little bit windy, they'll just stay at home. And so if it's a tsunami or a tornado, I think it would be pretty bad weather, and they probably wouldn't do very well. Maybe if they could find somewhere to hide in a tree or something, they could wait it out. But otherwise, I think they would have a difficult time, and they might get blown away.
That's kind of sad for bats. Maybe that tree would just stay rooted in the ground and they'd be okay. Fingers crossed for the bats. And our last question here from Ms. Mark's class in Fergus, Ontario. They comment, they've heard that many bat colonies are in danger. What is endangering bats?
Oh yeah, so I didn't really talk about this, but there's a lot of the reason that we're doing stuff with bats, and that we're doing stuff with bats at the zoo is that bats in Ontario and in eastern Canada are not having a very good time at the moment, and so a lot of them are endangered. And the main reason for that is a disease called white nose syndrome, and this is a disease caused by a fungus, and it grows in the caves where some of the bats hibernate. And so when the bats go into the caves in the winter, the fungus starts to grow on them, and it makes them wake up during hibernation, and they run out of energy, and then there's nothing to eat, so they can't survive. And so white nose is pretty terrible. In caves where we have records, it's killed up to 92% of the bats in a cave, and so that's quite a problem for bats. And so that's one of the major things that we're working on at the moment, and we're hoping that the bats may develop some resistance to the disease, and that they might be able to recover from this, but we have to wait and see. Bats are also threatened just by habitat loss, so people don't like having bats in their houses, so they might have them removed from the house, or we cut down trees and forests, and that takes away the places that the bats might live. And there's also, bats can also be injured by wind turbines. So the big wind turbines that are put up to generate power, unfortunately, when bats fly close to those, they can be killed. And so it's another topic which is receiving a lot of attention, but it's a concern for us with conserving bats.
So this leads me to one more question, even though I said that was the last one. What can our viewers do then to help? Is there anything they can do as individuals?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So it's difficult to do too much directly with the bats because they're small and they're hard to find, and you don't want to go touching them. However, I think one of the most important things that anyone watching this could do to help bats is just to be aware of them and to know that they're out there. They're very interesting animals, and that they are facing these risks from from this disease and habitat loss. And so just knowing about bats and knowing that they are lovely, interesting animals rather than scary vampires, I think is very important. If you do know of a location where there are roosts, so if you have bats living in your house or your cottage, then you can report that. So there's a website called batwatch.ca where you can report that you have bats. And you can also, if you get interested, you can try and get involved in bats. And so I know that it's sort of early, but there are a lot of community projects with bats now. So if you're in Toronto, you can borrow a bat detector from Hyde Park Nature Centre and take it home and listen to your bats. And I don't know the details, but I know that in other areas like Alberta and further west, there are bat projects similar to that as well. So you can look out for things like that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for teaching us all about echolocation and bats and threats to bats and what we can do. I've certainly learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did too. So thank you so much for joining us.
Great. It's been a lot of fun.
So next up on PIR Live Event, we are learning about hydraulic fracturing and its water cycle. More information on this and other upcoming webinars is available at pirweb.org. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.